amounts of data is what we're going to be looking at here. In Foundation Project 3, we'll look at some of the strengths of working with raw files. In particular, the raw file's ability to capture and use large amounts of data is what we're going to be looking at here. This project uses the power of the new local correction tools in ACR, together with the extra detail contained in a raw file, to reveal hidden information in these areas here of the image, the blown out areas. So you notice this particular photo here was photographed with a lot of light coming from the left hand side, working into the image itself and blowing the highlights. Despite the fact that a top of camera flash was used to try and even out the lighting, there's still way more light coming from the left hand side of the frame than there is in the right hand side or the shadow areas. So you can end up with an image like this. Now, if we were working with a JPEG file, this would be a big problem because there'd be very little detail for us to work with. But as we're working with a raw file, let's actually open the image up and start to play with it and see if we can't actually bring back some of the detail that was lost. So I've just opened the photo up into Adobe Camera Raw. Notice that with the highlight and shadow warnings on, you'll see these large area problematic areas that you can see here. So these areas are indicating to us that detail is being lost. So this part of the picture where we are actually losing detail and pixels are being clipped. We can also see that in the histogram, because if you look up on the right hand side, you'll see that we have a peak pushed right up to the far right hand side of the histogram, indicating that again detail is being lost. Also, the upward facing arrow is colored white, indicating that also multiple channels are being clipped. One way that we can pull some detail back into this image is using the recovery slider. So we'll do that to start with. Then we'll try and play with some of the local correction tools. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. First thing we need to do is look at straightening and cropping, and that's step one in this project. So let's start by straightening and cropping the image. So the first thing we'll do is go to the straighten tool, and you'll notice that this portion of the image here, or the section on the barn itself, we have a part of the barn or a part of the structure that we can just click and drag the tool across in order to get that part to align with the image itself. Now this does two things. It both straightens, but it also tends to crop the image down to accommodate for the extra straightening. Now this might be a little bit too much because we're losing some detail on the front of the pig here. So we might just drag that down and rotate it down a little bit by moving the cursor outside, just so that we're getting some straightening effect, but not so much that we're losing lots of detail in the image. We'll also adjust the actual crop itself to make sure that we have an aspect ratio or a format that we're happy with. So we've still got some straightening, but not as much as what we had before. But we still have some detail for things like the pig in the head of the pig here in the foreground of the image. So if we're happy with that, once we've worked between the straightening and the crop tools, we can then go and select another tool just to apply that crop. Now remember, this is all applied non-destructively. So if we want to come back later and make changes, we can come into straightening or to crop and make changes to that image. If we want to remove it totally, we can do that as well by just clearing any of the development settings. Now in step 2 of the project, let's actually look at some of the output options that are selected for this image here. So if I just click on the workflow options at the base of the Adobe Camera Raw workspace, you'll see that we have a workflow options dialog that is displayed. One of the first things that we need to do is select the color space. Now the color space is an important decision. Selecting which color space we use will determine the color gamut that the image is actually working within. So here Adobe Camera Raw is set as the default. This is the one that is generally used for printing, magazine printing, newspaper printing, those sorts of things. sRGB is the one that's generally used for when you're adjusting your image to go out to screen, and Pro Photo is the biggest of the color spaces, and it's the one that is generally used for Lightroom, although a specific flavor of Pro Photo is used for Lightroom. So here we're going to select Adobe Camera Raw because this image is going to be going out to a print base or magazine base. Next thing we need to look at is the bit depth. Now here we have a choice of 8 and 16 bits per channel, and already you'll probably realize that making a decision between 8 and 16 bits is essentially a decision based on the number of tones that we have available to us for each of the channels. Here we have 16 bits selected because this gives us the greatest range of tones available for the image. Now even if your digital camera is not shooting in a full 16 bits, if it's shooting in 12 bits or 14 bits per channel, that file is saved, that raw file is saved within a 16 bits per channel space or file mode. So this gives you the chance of more information to play with, more tones to play with, less chance of posterization when you're playing with those tones as well. So for quality images I would always be selecting 16 bits per channel. Keep in mind though that this will actually determine the file size as well. A 16 bits per channel file is twice the size of an 8 bits per channel file. So keep that in mind in terms of processing and storage as well. The other options we have here is the ability to upsize or downsize the image at this point. So we can actually go to a smaller file if we have a specific outcome in mind, or go to a larger file if we need to print bigger than what we're capable of doing with the standard size. Now because we've cropped this image a little already, you'll notice that the pixel dimensions and the megapixels, the equivalent megapixels, has been reduced from its original capture. And the last thing that we have in this list is the ability for us to select the resolution. This is the spread of the pixels per inch. So generally speaking, this is set at 240. If you're going out to magazine work though, a lot of editors want you to use 300 pixels per inch. Now keep in mind that a digital file has no physical dimensions. In other words, it doesn't have dimensions in terms of inches or centimeters across and down. It actually has a bunch of pixels, and how those pixels are spread per inch is the way that the final dimensions of that file is actually determined. So in making the decision to go from 240 pixels per inch to 300 pixels per inch, we're cramming more pixels into an inch of the print, and therefore making the larger print size, the size of the print that we can make, slightly smaller, but we'll have more quality. The last option we have here in the Workflow Options dialog is the ability to open the raw file as a smart object into Photoshop, and we can select this and have that as our default. In other words, each time we click the Open Image option, then the raw file is embedded as a smart object in a new Photoshop document. This relieves us from the task of having to hold down the Shift key and then click the Open Object button in the ACR dialog. So I'm not going to have it as default, and I'm just going to click OK to make sure those workflow options are set. Notice that down at the base here now, our workflow options summary is actually displayed at the base of the Adobe Camera Raw dialog. Now let's work our way through some of the basic changes that need to be made to this image. For instance, we're on the basic tab here of the adjustments, and we can work from top to bottom in working through these controls to adjust the image itself. First of all, we'll select the white balance. Now at the moment the default option is as shot. This is what has been set by your camera. A lot of photographers tend to think that they can fix everything in Photoshop, or in this case Adobe Camera Raw, so they don't spend a lot of time actually doing things like setting white balance. This means that you have to spend more time later in doing corrections. If you get your white balance correct to start with, well then it'll come in as shot and you won't need to worry about making any adjustments here. If you do need to make adjustments, there's three ways that we can do it. First one is to actually select the light source that was used to take the photo. So in this case it would have been flash, a mixture of flash and daylight. So you could go down and just select flash and use that as your base. Or you can actually go through and select auto and get Adobe Camera Raw to try and determine the best white balance for the image itself. If that's no good or not giving you the results that you want, you can come here and slide the temperature slider, which goes from a blue through to yellow. It makes the image more blue if you move it this way, more yellow if you move it this way, and actually has a measurement in Kelvin. So if you know the color temperature of your light source, then you can set it here. We also have a second slider, a tint slider, which goes from green through to magenta, which is really helpful for removing color casts that are produced by strip lighting or fluorescent lighting. The last option that we have for adjusting the color in the image is to actually select the white balance tool from the toolbar at the top of the screen. If we click on that, then we can go and find a neutral part of the scene, that is part of the scene that should be the same values for red, green and blue channels. Click on that part of the scene and the rest of the image will be adjusted, the color in the rest of the image will be adjusted to ensure that the red, green values in this part that you've clicked on are actually the same value. So it's great if you've got a grey card in the scene or you have a neutral tone in the scene somewhere that you can be actually working with. Color's pretty good on this one, so let's move on to the next step. Now we'll look at some global tonal controls. As we saw when we first opened up the image, there were some real problems with highlight clipping. So I'll just drag the recovery slider down again just to show you that highlight clipping warning that's coming in on our image. If I turn off the highlight clipping warning in the top right hand corner, you'll notice we have no indication now that there's clipping occurring in the image. You might say to me, well, I can see on screen that there's clipping occurring. The problem with that is all screens tend to be a little bit different, and if you haven't calibrated your screen recently, it can be providing you with misleading information. So better to make sure that your highlight clipping warning and your shadow clipping warning are both turned on. That way, if I just pull my blacks up as well, you'll be able to get a preview of areas of the image which are where the pixels are being clipped or pushed to pure white or pure black. Now notice up in the actual highlight clipping warning upward facing arrow, you'll see that it changes color according to which channels are being clipped. If all channels are being clipped, then the upward arrow is actually white. If we pull down black now, notice that as we move away from clipping, as we actually change the black point in the image and some of the pixels are actually not being clipped, you'll notice that the arrow is changed to red. This means that the red channel is the channel that's being clipped now. If we pull it down further, you'll notice that it actually changes to black, which means no pixels are being clipped at this point. Also up in the highlight area, you'll notice it's in full white, which means all three channels are being clipped. We can pull down exposure as one way that we can try and reduce the amount of highlights being clipped. The other way is to try and rebuild some of the data that is being lost using the recovery slider, and we've done that as well. Notice that it is now black, and over here we actually have some more clipping occurring in the shadow area. So we'll pull that down a bit, push up fill light a little bit, and now we have two warnings that the upward facing arrows are both black, meaning there's no clipping occurring. If you don't want these warnings on permanently, you can actually turn them off, and if you hold down the Alt or Opt key, you'll be able to preview the clipping warning or the clip areas that are being clipped in the actual preview space as well. But I prefer to leave them on just so that when I'm making other changes in this dialog, I'll be able to see if any of that's resulting in clipping in my image itself. Now if we pay attention to the other slider or tonal controls that we have in the rest of this dialog, you'll see that we have exposure, which controls highlight point, recovery, which pulls back your highlights that are being lost or clipped, fill light, which pushes up the lower shadow areas more towards the midtones, and blacks, which establishes our black point. We also have brightness. Now brightness a lot of people confuse with exposure, but it actually allows us to adjust the mid-tone brightness of the image and tends not to produce the same clipping that exposure would. Contrast is the mid-tone contrast of the image. Clarity and these color controls here allow us to provide more local contrast to the image. Clarity is particularly useful if you're working on an image that was shot on an overcast day or where there's some fog or mist around, and it provides more of a local contrast to the image. Saturation allows us to push up the strength of the colors in the image, but one of the problems with working with saturation is notice what's happening to the skin tone on this arm here. It's actually being pushed beyond what's realistic. The problem with saturation is it applies the same level of change to all hues in the image itself, despite whether those hues are already saturated or not. So in this situation here, we don't really want skin tones to be pumped up, and we don't really want colors that are already quite strong to be pumped up. That's where vibrance comes in. Vibrance works on those colors in the image that are desaturated or pastel in nature. It also tends to protect Caucasian skin tones as well, so we're not getting a big change in those skin tones that you can see there. So vibrance is probably a better and more controllable way of pumping up the brightness or the vividness of your color in your image. So now that we've adjusted the global or the whole of the image tonal and color controls, let's start to look at localized correction. This is correction where we're actually just adjusting or changing parts of the picture. This is new for cs4 and Adobe Camera Raw and is in line with the changes of features in Lightroom 2.0. So if you can use the features here in Adobe Camera Raw, you'll also be able to use them in Lightroom 2.0, and the development settings that are saved off here will also be respected and be available in Lightroom 2.0 as well. So the localized correction options that we have in Adobe Camera Raw are based around two new tools. So if we go up to the toolbar, we have the adjustment brush and we have the graduated filter. In this situation here, we're going to make use of the adjustment brush to do some burning in of the parts of the image that are too bright. Now notice that when I select the adjustment brush, we get a new pane that sits inside the right hand side of the dialog. We have three options at the top here: new, adjust, and new, add, and erase. We have the ability to change the image characteristics all the way through these different controls here, as well as change color as well. So we need to set these back to 0, and I'll just make sure that this is set on white as well, and everything else is back to 0. Now what we want to try and do here is make a change in exposure. So we want to darken these areas of the image. So we'll just click and drag down the exposure control, and we'll drag it down a fair way. We'll say 2 EV. So this is actually in exposure values. As I move the cursor over the image, you'll notice that we have a brush cursor which has an outside circle and an inside circle. Inside circle is where the adjustment is going to be applied at 100% or more solidly, and the outside circle is the extent of the feather. So you can adjust the feather by adjusting this slider here. So notice how the inside circle is now closer to the outside circle. So the brush is actually getting harder as we move the feather towards the left. We can adjust the size of the brush here as well. The flow, in other words, when we click and drag, how much of the effect is actually being applied across that drag, and also the density. That is the strength of the effect that's being applied. So if we drag this down to 50%, then only 50, or value of 50, then only 50% of the effect is being applied at that time. We also have the ability to show the mask and auto mask. Auto mask applies the changes to within a specific area and looks for sharp edges in order to do that, or contrasty edges in order to do that. We'll just leave that off at the moment. I'm just going to do quite a broad change here so that you can see what's happening with the image. So I'm just going to click and drag over these areas. Now you'll notice it's probably a little bit too strong here, but you'll also notice that we're able to actually burn in quite a lot of detail here. Now this detail wouldn't be available if we were working with a JPEG file. And you'll say to me, oh, hang on a sec, Philip, this is way too strong. We don't need the effect to be this strong. And you're correct. But the great thing about working with the adjustment brush is that once you've actually made the adjustment and painted it on, and let's just show the mask. So that's the area that's actually being brushed there. And you can change the color of the mask too. So here we'll change it to red so that we can see the mask. Okay, so that's the area being adjusted there. You'll also notice that there's a pin here as well, and the pin indicates that a localized adjustment has been applied to the image, and if we roll over the pin you'll get a preview of the mask also. The great thing about working with these adjustment brush is that any of these entries can now be changed. So for instance, I can actually lighten up the density of what we've just brushed in, so you can see how I can change specifically what's going on there. I can also do things like adjust saturation, clarity, sharpness, all of these controls here. I can make adjustments to this part of the image based on the mask that I've just drawn on the picture itself. So it's a very powerful tool, a very powerful control. Now you can add to this masked area, in other words apply the same settings over other parts of the image by just going and selecting the pin. Make sure the pin has got the black dot in the center, and now you can go and brush in the same level of change to other parts of the image as well. If you want to actually make a new change, or you may want to, or if you want to adjust a different part of the image, well then you can go up here and just click on the new option or the new mode. And in this case we're actually going to click on the auto mask option, and we'll bring this back to 0, bring all the settings back to 0, and we're going to actually reduce the saturation of this blue shirt, which tends to dominate. So we'll just brush in this area, and you'll notice that using the auto mask option it's keeping the adjustment to just the area that I'm working in. So in this case it's the shirt, because it's looking for the sharp edges and applying the adjustment just to the image and automatically adjusting those sharp edges. So you see as I move over, it's just this part of the image that it's working on. There's a little bit extra coming over in the trouser there. We can actually select erase and erase that part of the adjustment there, so it's not working in the trouser itself. So now that we've got that mask made for the shirt, we can actually adjust the saturation of that shirt independently. So you can see here we're increasing the saturation or decreasing the saturation. Notice the shirt's getting a little bit lighter as we're decreasing the saturation, so we could also decrease the brightness of that shirt as well, so that we can make an adjustment where the shirt isn't as dark isn't as saturated, and we can balance out the desaturation by decreasing some of the brightness as well. So that's localized adjustment using the adjustment tool. To get out of the tool we can just go and select another option in the toolbar. With the next step, let's actually look at converting this image to grayscale and then adding a bit of a tint or a tone to it. So we'll just go up to the hue, saturation and lightness option, luminance, hue, saturation and luminance option, which also has a grayscale setting here as well. So if we click on convert to grayscale, it'll do a conversion based on the defaults, which is like an automatic option. But you can come in then and make changes specifically about how particular color ranges are actually converted to grayscale. So notice the shirt again, as I move this slider to the right, then the blue will be converted to a lighter grey. As I move it further to the left, then the blue will be converted to a darker grey. And you can make specific changes to the way in which the colours are mapped to grey using that control. If we then click on the next tab, it's the split toning tab, and here we can actually apply a tint or a tone to the image itself. Now you can do that by applying a different color to highlights and also to shadows. And if I hold down the Alt or Opt key as I'm moving across the slider in the hue slider, you'll see a full 100% saturation being applied to just the highlights. So this will give you a way of selecting the best color for the actual image. Taking my finger off that option, then I can grab the saturation control and then drag up until I've just got enough detail or density or vibrance of that color coming through. I'll do the same thing for the shadows. I'll hold down the Alt or Opt key and I'll drag in and just try and get a blue shadow happening here. Remember, that's at 100% when you hold down the Alt or Opt key. It's 100% saturation. We don't want 100% saturation, so I'll take my finger off and then we'll just gradually bring some of that color into the shadow areas. Now notice we also have a balance slider here as well. Moving it to the left will cause the image to be tinted more the shadow tone or shadow color, in this case a blue. Moving it to the right will change where the split is occurring and will push more of the highlight color into the image. So you can adjust which parts of the image are tinted shadows color and which parts of the image are tinted the highlight color using the balance slider. With that split toning applied, we'll now move on to the lens correction. Now if you have been using a wide angle lens and you've got some fringing occurring, well then you can use this chromatic aberration tools here in order to remove some of that fringing. We can also apply some vignetting. If you're using a wide angle lens and you've got lightening in the corners or darkening in the corners, you can apply that vignetting correction here. But notice for Adobe Camera Raw 5 we also have post-crop vignetting as well, because this vignetting will apply an even adjustment across a non-cropped image. In this case we've cropped and rotated the image, so we would like, if we want to apply some creative vignetting, so we want to darken the corners a little bit, we can do that using the post-crop vignetting tool, knowing that it will be centered on our image as it appears now, not in its uncropped or original format. The amount controls the density, so moving to the left makes the vignette dark, moving to the right makes the vignette light. So here we want to darken the edges a little bit. Midpoint, you can control how much of the image is being darkened by this adjustment. Moving to the left, more of the image is being darkened. Moving to the right, less of the image is being darkened and more of the corners, just the corners are being darkened. The roundness slider is particularly useful in that it gives us the ability to restrict the adjustments to just the edges or around the center. Now if I turn off the feather for a minute, you'll see how this works. So adjust more on the edges of the picture, or it's more rounded. So the roundness control is a really good one for adjusting how the effect is being applied to the image. Feathering, on the other hand, is how softly the graduation being applied to the darkening can be adjusted for this photo. So you can see here as we're moving it up it's a lot softer, as we're moving it down it's a lot stronger and more obvious. So let's just apply a little bit of darkening to the edges and adjust the midpoint as well, and maybe not quite as much. Okay, there we go. So that's adjusting the post-crop vignetting for the image. Now let's turn our attention to the sharpness of the image. Okay, and to do that we need to go to the Detail tab. An important thing for you to remember is if you have a look at this zoom preview to 100% or larger warning here, you won't see the indication of sharpening applied to your image if you have the image at less than 100%. So let's just pull it up to 100% so that we can see what's actually happening to the image itself when we change the sharpening controls. So we'll pull in a part of the image where we can see sharpening being applied to the photo itself. The amount is the strength of the sharpening. The radius is how far afield from an individual pixel the feature looks in order to determine whether something is an edge or not. Detail brings in, like, I guess it's more of a grittiness to the image itself and helps you retain or get a look of extra detail in your image, brings some more local contrast around the detail of the photo itself. And masking, very importantly, and if I hold down the Alt-Opt key, you will see an integrated mask slider here now. The areas that are white are the areas that are being sharpened, the areas that are black are not being sharpened. So when you're on 0, all of the image is being sharpened. As you move up, gradually more and more of the image is not being sharpened, and the sharpening is being just applied to the edges of the image. This is good if you want to keep your skin tones smooth without applying any of the sharpening to the skin tones itself. In this image it doesn't really matter that much because it's a strong gritty image. We also have noise reduction in this part of the ACR dialog as well. Luminance is the grayscale noise that you'll see in some images, especially if you're using high ISO or you're using long exposures. And color noise is the random red, green and blue pixels that you see in the image. So you can use these independent of each other in order to provide better noise reduction for your image as well. Okay, and the last part of the process is for us to actually now output the image now that we've made all the adjustments. We can do that by clicking Open Image to open the image into Photoshop. It will change the image from its raw file to a flat file, Photoshop file, but it will save these adjustments to the raw file, and so you'll be able to preview those in Bridge and come in and make changes to them if you wish as well. If we hold down Shift, you'll notice it changes to Open Object, which allows us to open the raw file in Photoshop but embed it in a smart object, which you'll see that a lot of the techniques that we talk about in this book are based on opening the raw file as a smart object. If we just hit Done, well then this will actually apply the changes that we've got here to the file and update the preview inside Bridge. But remember, all of these changes are applied non-destructively. You can remove them or adjust them at any time by simply opening them up into Adobe Camera Raw again. And finally, on the left hand side, we have the ability to save the image. So if you save the image off as anything other than a DNG, which is Adobe's open source RAW format, then the changes that we've made here will be applied to the file. So if you save it as a TIFF, will be applied to the file and you won't be able to remove them. If you save it as a DNG, then you can come in and make those changes or adjustments to these settings that we've applied here later on.